Welcome to the podcast, David and Sean.
Great to be back.
Thanks for having me.
David, I want to dive right in and start with the basics of what we used to call New Start and what we now call JobSeeker. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of the payment, when it was introduced, and what's happened to its rate of indexation over time?
Well, the unemployment benefit as we know it now dates back to the Hawke government, but really the fundamental decision about about its current level was made during the Howard government. And that basic decision was that the age pension would be indexed to wages. The unemployment benefit, called New Start at the time, would be indexed to the consumer price index. Now that means that the rate for unemployed people stays up with prices, but it doesn't grow in real terms over and above those prices. Whereas what we've seen with the age pension is that it's steadily increased because it's linked to wages, which have done fairly well over the long term. That changes right now because, of course, inflation is much higher than wages. Real wages are going down. But the point is that there's been a long period of kind of neglect of JobSeeker, and that's emboldened people, or really driven people to the point where they say, look, Labor's now in power. It said that it didn't think JobSeeker was at the right level. It didn't promise an increase, but now's the time to make that increase because the cost of living crisis is really biting and people deserve a higher base rate, which at the moment is $693 a fortnight. And we know rents are incredibly high. They're going up. A lot of costs are going up for people.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so that sort of key decision by the Howard government basically hived off or split the two payments so that pensioners were basically keeping up with rising standards of living, whereas people who are on unemployment benefits were very much just keeping their head above water in economic terms.
And I suppose in fairness, I forgot to mention, the JobSeeker rate went up $50 a fortnight during the pandemic. There were lots of temporary increases, and then the Morrison government made a decision increase it permanently by $50 a fortnight. But that still leaves people with a lot of financial pressure, and it still means that there's a block within the caucus, about 9 MPs, who say increase the rate.
Yep, I want to get into that later because that was an interesting economic experiment that happened during the pandemic when they raised the rate of JobSeeker. Sean, we now have a lot of voices who are calling for a raise in the rate of JobSeeker. They include, Council for Social Services, a lot of charities, not-for-profits. It includes sort of the business community who say that it's actually a barrier to employment. And of course, there's some Labor backbenchers who also want it raised. But crucially, there's an Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee that was convened by the Albanese government which has also called for a raise in the rate as their sort of primary recommendation. Can you tell us a little bit about that committee's creation and what they found?
Well, sure. The committee came about at the behest of the independent Senator David Pocock, former Wallabies captain, of course, and he asked for this as part of the negotiation over Labor's industrial relations laws. So Labor got their industrial relations laws, and David Pocock got this Economics Inclusion Advisory Committee. And the committee is quite significant, firstly, because it is a government committee. Pocock asked for it, but the government was very happy when it was announcing the appointments to the committee to say, this is the Albanese Labor government's new Economic Advisory Committee. So, there was a bit of something close to boasting, I think, that this was something Labor had done. There's also, a bit of a feeling out there that maybe Labor were holding back this JobSeeker stuff as a negotiating tactic, that they knew they would be asked for it and here was something they could give, and they knew that they would have to raise JobSeeker at some point. So they created the committee, and the committee came back with a report a few weeks ago. And one of the things that is really important to recognise about the committee, and Jackie, you referred to this, is that it is not just a bunch of predictable suspects, bleeding hearts. There are, some people who you might ordinarily expect to be on the other side of this. You have the Business Council of Australia represented. You have economists there. There is a pretty strong view, consensus view, from a very wide range of groups, sectors, parts of society now saying JobSeeker needs to rise. Now, the committee made 37 recommendations. the government has incorporated as one of its talking point when asked about JobSeeker. They say, oh, well, it was one of 37 recommendations. It was very, very, very clear in the committee's report that this was the first recommendation. The committee said this should be government's first priority. It was the first listed in the report. Nobody, I think, is in any doubt that the committee thinks this is the first thing that should be done. And it even goes so far as to say other things, which I suspect the government will get to in the budget, like increasing rent assistance, aren't as effective, aren't as well targeted. So JobSeeker is really where the debate is as a result of this committee, which the government did create.
Right. So this is a committee that was set up by the Albanese government, albeit as a sort of key demand of Senator David Pocock. And the committee has recommended a, quote, substantial increase to the base rate of the JobSeeker payment. But it's not looking at all like the government is planning on heeding that advice, is it, David?
No, it's not going to heed that advice in full. In fact, there are reservations inside the government about, what the committee has called for. There's not an acceptance of those 37 recommendations and the arguments for all of them. What happened is, the government could see this coming. As soon as it got the document, it costed it. So when the public got to see this report, the media were also briefed on the cost of the recommendations. And that's a very fundamental and important part of the media management of this report. And the cost ended up being more than 30 billion for all of them, specifically for the increase in JobSeeker, 24 billion over 4 years. And so therefore, we weren't just reporting, well, this is the request or recommendation. We were also reporting, this is the implication.
Yeah.
And so that did inform the debate, and the government was making it clear that it simply couldn't afford to do all of that. 24 billion over 4 years, they don't want to do. So ever since then, we've had a debate about, well, what should the increase be? Should some people get an increase and other people not? We know, for instance, after work by our colleague here at the Herald, Rachel Clun, that there is an increase for single mothers in the parenting payment. That's separate. So there are decisions being made about who are the most vulnerable people and what should they get. And an across-the-board increase in JobSeeker simply hasn't been signalled as a priority by the Expenditure Review Committee of Federal Cabinet, and that's the group that makes the call.
However, we are hearing that there might be an increase for people over 55 who are on the JobSeeker payment because, according to the government's reasoning, as far as we know it, they are some of the most vulnerable job seekers, and they tend to be dominated by, that cohort tends to be dominated by women who are at particular risk of poverty and having low amounts of super and having a precarious attachment to the workforce over the course of their lives because of their caring responsibilities generally. Is that what we're hearing?
Well, the reason I haven't sort of gone right onto the front page with a big call about an increase in JobSeeker for over 55s is that I received some signals of caution from inside the government. I think it's not as simple as that. Specifically, what I have been told is that the details are not correct. So therefore, I'm very wary of getting out there and saying this is absolutely happening. One thing that we know at the moment is that if you are 60 and over and you've been on New Start for 9 months, you get a higher rate now. The base rate is $693 a fortnight. If you're over 60, it can be $745 a fortnight for a single. Now, that's not including other allowances. What we don't know is whether that stays, how much it changes, whether that 60 age bracket simply drops down to 55 and then covers everybody with a higher allowance, or whether there's something else. And so that's why I think people need to be cautious about what they're hearing here. But there's clearly pressure on the government to show that it understands that there are people out there who need more help, and it's got to find a way to fund some of this support. But day by day, I mean, let's face it, most of the decisions are made now. It's only a couple of days before the budget is printed.
Yeah.
And there's no sign of across-the-board help for JobSeeker people.
I think these rumours about an age-graded payment are really fascinating because I think we've seen the debate around JobSeeker over the last month be far more sophisticated than any debate I remember seeing around unemployment payments. We used to call it the dole, of course, and Work for the dole was, a really big deal when John Howard introduced it, and a really big part of political debate at the time. And there has been, ever since then, a pretty strong rhetoric around, best form of welfare is a job. That's the type of thing Scott Morrison used to say. He gave a speech with the title "Best Form of Welfare Is," and it wasn't a real cliffhanger. This time, in the last few weeks, I think there has been a really strong push from the community sector to make it very clear to people that, in fact, a low job seeker is a barrier to employment. It's not that you set a low job seeker amount and that encourages everybody to get out there and hunt like crazy for good jobs. In fact, because they can't feed themselves, because they can't heat their own homes, because their children aren't well, they are actually staying home. They are not able to get to job interviews. They are not able to apply for jobs. So we've actually seen a flip of that debate, if you like. And alongside that, we've seen a really strong recognition that there are essentially two groups of people on JobSeeker, and there are groups within those groups, but very broadly, there are some people who, yes, could look for work, and the government's very clear in saying, wouldn't it be great if they could get work? And then there is a very large group of people who have been unemployed for a very long time. And we know that the longer you are unemployed for, and especially if you are unemployed for a long time when you are older, you are just incredibly unlikely to get back in the workforce. So if JobSeeker is set at a low rate, as it is currently, that keeps people living in poverty, then effectively the government, any government, is saying to that very large group of people, we are content to let you live in poverty. Because they're not going to get a job. That's a brutal reality, but it is the reality. So I think those two features of this debate, seeing them emerge, has made this a much more complex debate. And I think it means that the government now, in looking at how to act, is trying to look at those different categories of people. That's absolutely not satisfying everybody. There's been a lot of outrage over the last few weeks at the idea that young people who are still living in poverty may not get any increase to JobSeeker. Obviously, we're going to have to wait till budget night, but I think this debate is far more interesting than it used to be.
That's such a good point. It feels like not so long ago that we were talking even about drug testing and people's, drug testing trials and people's payments being withheld if they tested positive for drugs. So it's a very different calibre of debate that we're having now. It's interesting because the Labor government does say that they want to look after the most disadvantaged, and that necessarily means that we have to have a conversation about who are the most disadvantaged groups. So it feels a bit Hunger Games at times. David, just quickly, can you run us through the polling that we had in our paper about the public support for lifting JobSeeker and then the government's sort of pragmatism, I suppose, on this? It's not exactly going to be a huge vote winner for them, is it, if they lifted JobSeeker across the board?
Well, it's interesting because our columnist, Ross Gittins, wrote a really good column this week about JobSeeker.
Yeah.
And he made the point that, some people calculate there are no votes in increasing unemployment benefits. But there are hundreds of thousands of people who rely on these benefits. So I actually think there are votes in increasing JobSeeker. And it's something that Labor's got to recognise, because some of those votes are in seats that might swing to the Greens in the inner cities. So I think that's a real factor. Don't dismiss the political importance of giving people in need. When we polled voters in general on this, we found that 42% supported an increase in JobSeeker, but that's short of a majority, clearly. 32% oppose it. The rest are undecided. When we asked about other measures, we asked, what do you think about increasing incentives for women with children to return to work? 61% support. I think that's really interesting in itself. People want more help, childcare, paid parental leave. They want that to make it more affordable for women to go back to work, keep their kids in good care. I think that's where the debate's at. JobSeeker, it doesn't have majority support. Labor would know that. And I think you can see that with some of the government's priorities right now. They're increasing pay for aged care workers. They've got to, the Fair Work Commission says that the pay should go up. That's $11 billion over 4 years. They're making big commitments on Medicare, $2.2 billion so far. I think there'll be more in the budget. I think there'll be action on the Medicare rebate, for instance. At the same time, they're recovering $3.3 billion in tobacco excise. All these moving parts are happening, but you can see the priorities. Invest in Medicare, invest in aged care. keep the sustainability of the National Disability Insurance Scheme. They're the priorities over and above JobSeeker at the moment. And this is the calculation within the Expenditure Review Committee of Cabinet, which is making these decisions, despite all the calls from those who want higher income support.
It does become very utilitarian sometimes, this debate about these competing priorities. Sean, you wrote a wonderful piece for our papers this week, one of my favourites of yours, and I'm a big fan generally. In that piece you wrote, quote, "If Labor continues to assert that it will always seek to help the most vulnerable, then at some point it must do so or come up with a different description of itself." Is this a tension that Albanese and Labor can ever resolve, though? Will they ever be able to help all the people who are disadvantaged in this country and that they might want to help?
No, look, this is, I think, the curse in any for any Labor government, for any progressive government around the world, that they want to do good things, and at some point it is impossible to do all of the good things that you want to do. And this is definitely a source of frustration for Labor ministers, for the Labor cabinet. I think they definitely are feeling the heat over JobSeeker and are a bit frustrated at some of the heat that the question is gathering. But I think this comes back to the politics, interestingly. Labor are defining themselves this way. Tanya Plibersek was out there saying, we're a Labor government and we look for every opportunity to help the most disadvantaged people. Now, that was her answer to a question about JobSeeker. The Prime Minister was asked a question about JobSeeker, and he used a very similar form of words. A Labor government will always look for ways in which we can provide assistance to those in need. So the Labor government is out there defining Labor as the party that will always try to help the most vulnerable. If you're going to define yourself that way, fine, good, even. But I think it's important in politics, if you talk about yourself in a certain way, you do have to match that with actions at some point. And it is possible to go through particular measures and say they're this popular or this unpopular. I think that's interesting and important considerations for a political party. But also there are broader questions sometimes about values. And I make the point in that column, Kevin Rudd, the emissions trading scheme was becoming increasingly unpopular for him. But the moment he dropped that, his own numbers plummeted, and they plummeted because he was seen to no longer match the things that he'd been saying. And I think this is always a danger for Labor, that because there are all of these groups that it should be helping, and it's not going to be able to help them all, there is always the possibility of this disconnect between its rhetoric about itself, between what people take to be its values and what it does, times what it can do. And that is a political danger as well as something that's substantively important.
Can I chip in with an old quote that I love? It's by George Orwell, and he wrote it in his last notebook. For a left-wing party in power, its most serious antagonist is always its own past propaganda. I've used that in columns. I love the quote because it's so right. He wrote it in 1949. I mean, parties always, especially Labor, any other party of the left, always has to live up to its own past rhetoric. And that's the challenge that Anthony Albanese and all his crew are going through right at this minute, as Sean says.
Yep. It's a really tough spot, and it's a very, very fine line that they've got to walk. I want to segue now to Anthony Albanese's interesting decision this week to appear on the television show of controversial British TV personality Piers Morgan. He, of course, has touched down in London for King Charles' coronation, at which he will swear allegiance, we've been told. And the first thing he did, pretty much, getting off the plane, was to sit down with Piers Morgan. Now, Piers Morgan has a little bit of a controversial background. Sean, I don't know if you know much about him. He, of course, his show is on Fox in the US and it's on Sky News here in Australia. So it's a very specific demographic he speaks to. Piers Morgan was implicated very, very heavily in the phone hacking scandal in Britain in the 2000s. He's mounted a real jihad against Meghan Markle in particular, and a lot of bullying and, sort of really quite nasty rhetoric about her. It's safe to say he's a sort of pretty controversial guy, right?
Yeah, I mean, he's controversial. He's also popular in certain ways, as in he's a very, very well-known figure in Britain. Somebody described it to me as it's a little bit like if Karl Stefanovic was a Twitter troll, and I think that's probably a fair description. Piers Morgan is at times a general right-wing commentator, and at times he's really pushing the line. He's obviously doing it very deliberately. When Meghan Markle talked about her mental health concerns, he was pretty derogatory about that.
Well, he said that she was lying, basically, about saying that she was suicidal after being hounded by the press.
Yeah. Look, he will say awful things, and has a pretty checkered professional history. He was a very young star editor. I think the youngest editor of a national newspaper in the UK at 29, and then not too long after that ended up publishing fake photographs of the Iraq War, and that was obviously a huge controversy. So look, he is a controversial figure. He has this odd ability to draw big stars. People do agree to be interviewed by him. So look, it's not a complete shock to me that Anthony Albanese said yes to it.
And it would have a particular viewership here in Australia, it being broadcast on Sky News. David, what were the key things that Albanese said in the course of his 1 hour interview? What issues did he talk about?
It was pretty broad-ranging. And I think that for all the controversy about Piers Morgan, the questions tended to be fairly straightforward on a lot of subjects, like nuclear-powered submarines, the coronation, Anthony Albanese's attitude towards the Republic and the monarchy.
Yep.
All of these things, I think, were answered in a very measured way by the Prime Minister. And I think the key thing was he was asked, will you swear allegiance to the King? And his response was, well, I do that every time there's a new parliament. And it's true. You have to swear an oath every time the new parliament meets. So he's done that often. And I think he's sort of diffusing that whole controversy about whether he should swear allegiance to the King. And he's managing that, I think, in a very, mature way. He's a Republican. He's not telling the British they shouldn't have a monarchy. He says Australia shouldn't have a monarchy. But he's accepting the outcome of the 1999 referendum in Australia. And therefore, he will swear allegiance to the King because that is the institutional structure within which he works. I thought his answers on that were all very, quite solid. He did get a question, what is a woman? He said that's an adult female. He's actually had that question before. Some people don't like it when that gets raised. I guess that's the risk you run when you agree to an interview with Piers Morgan. And I guess finally on that point, Piers Morgan, I don't think is he still on Fox?
Yes.
It was an interview with Talk TV, and I just questioned what the audience size was for that interview and whether it was actually worth the Prime Minister's time.
Yeah, he was obviously speaking to an Australian audience. He was also questioned about boat people policy, because that's something that's sort of controversial in Britain at the moment, because they've essentially adopted the Australian policy on that. And he tied himself up in knots a little bit because he, once disagreed with that. Now he agrees with our boat policy. You say it was potentially a sort of strange and obscure audience, but in agreeing to do the interview, who do you think he was trying to talk to, Sean? Who do you think Albo's trying to reach with that cohort?
Look, politicians are always political in everything they do. So I think there are two parts of this answer. One is, to be more generous to the Prime Minister on what is definitely a questionable decision. He has always taken the view that he should speak to a wide range of interviewers. I remember this when I was a press secretary for Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, and Albanese would, I would not be so keen on some interviewers because I didn't see the point in legitimising them, and Albanese would always want to do them, and they weren't going to bring him fame, they weren't going to raise his profile hugely, but he just had a view that you should talk to a wide range of people, a wide range of audiences. And so I think that is a big part of it. The politics, which you can never ignore, is that I think when he does do those things, he is sending a subtle signal to journalists, to people following politics closely, that he's not talking within a progressive bubble.
Yeah.
He's not interested in confining himself to the good burgers of Marrickville. Like he is out there talking to people.
Yeah.
So that's a message as much as it is a decision.
Yeah.
Can I wing it on this? I've just Googled as we're talking the viewership for Piers Morgan. The Talk TV, it's a Rupert Murdoch channel. Talk TV, the viewership for his show has plummeted, right? It used to be 317,000 viewers when it launched. as of last year, it was about 62,000 viewers a week. Now, that's not a high rating show for the Prime Minister of Australia, in my opinion.
No.
So I'm interested in Sean's take on this, because Sean's been inside the PMO on these decisions. My take is that Anthony Albanese did it not because he was reaching a large audience, but because he was kind of proving a point. He can talk to the right, and he's tough enough to get through it, right? So I think it's almost a point of pride for him now that he can do that. He can get along with Kyle Sandilands. He can talk to Piers Morgan. He can talk on Sky. The thing that's got me, the thought that occurs to me on this is, well, when was Peter Dutton last on ABC Radio National? When did he last do a sit-down interview with a left-wing publication? He doesn't do it. He's more constrained in who he can talk to. Whereas Anthony Albanese is showing quite a skill at talking across the political spectrum.
I think that's a really good point to make. And I think Albanese, on that point, Sean, I think he had quite a good relationship with Alan Jones and used to go on Alan Jones' show, whereas obviously Alan Jones was not popular amongst other parts of the Labor caucus. Just briefly, let's touch on Kyle Sandilands. The Prime Minister went to Kyle Sandilands' wedding, big celebrity wedding last weekend. He was photographed. There are all these celebrities and kind of, a few D-listers and even a few sort of underworldy kind of colourful Sydney characters, shall we say. What do we glean from all of this? Kyle Sandilands is a sort of real loudmouth, shock jock kind of guy. What does it tell us about how Albanese is happy to be perceived amongst the general public, to be sort of associated with these brash populist types?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and I don't feel like I know is the truth. I think, look, I mean, we can't ignore the fact that Kyle Sandilands is a hugely, hugely popular radio host, right? Like whatever we might think of him.
Yeah, and I do think he is quite pro-Labor as well, Kyle Sandilands. Like, as much as he's political, I think he's a Labor guy.
So if Albanese can talk to him, it's probably a helpful thing if Sandilands is on his side into the future, going into the next election. And it also probably gives a sense of Albanese as somebody who's willing to laugh at himself a bit, because even though the Sandilands wedding was obviously an exercise in performative luxury, 150 grand on flowers and whatnot, it's also not, it's not a posh person's wedding in the same way.
It's very knockabout, isn't it? And maybe he just wanted a bit of a party and a nice dinner and some nice wine after all of that hard work he's been doing just before the budget. Thank you very much, gentlemen. That has been a fascinating discussion. And Sean, thank you for joining us. We'll have you back if you will come back.
We'd love to. Thanks.
Great. Thank you all.